The Krell Armada dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Vertex system, with 3,000 warships arranged in formations that had crushed 100 civilizations, and Warlord Therix broadcast his ultimatum on all frequencies so every species in the galaxy could hear surrender. The human and his war beast within 12 hours or Station Vertex would be reduced to debris, and every ship that tried to defend it would be destroyed. Admiral Tai Yang stood in the command center of the defense fleet and looked at the tactical display, showing 800 Allied ships against overwhelming odds, and his weathered face showed no emotion as he began organizing defensive formations. The council convened an emergency session, and the debate lasted only 40 minutes before the vote came, and 23 species voted to surrender Hyunwoo and Wraith to save the station, while 17 voted to refuse humanity. His delegation walked out of the chamber, followed by the delegations from 6 other species who'd fought alongside human forces in previous conflicts. And Ambassador Jiwan's final words to the council were simple. History will remember who stood firm and who knelt. Taeyang had been skeptical of Hyunwoo when the young captain first arrived with his war beast companion. But watching someone refuse to bow under pressure earned respect that couldn't be bought or manufactured. He invited Hyunwoo to the strategy room and asked for tactical input without any of the condescension that older officers usually showed younger ones. And together they began planning a defense that might last long, enough for evacuation ships to get civilians to safety. The plan was desperate and relied on drawing the Krell fleet into close quarters, around the station where superior numbers mattered less. And while the defense fleet fought, Hyunwoo and Wraith would lead a strike team to board Therix's flagship Bora, called the plan. Suicide with extra steps, but she still helped outfit a stealth shuttle with equipment that might get them close enough to the Krell command ship before detection, and her hands shook while she worked because she'd lost too many colleagues already. The Krell fleet advanced on schedule, and their vanguard opened fire at extreme range, and plasma bolts began hammering Station Vertex's shields while point defense systems tried to intercept the incoming fire. Taeyang's fleet met them head-on in a coordinated strike that broke the Krell vanguard formation and forced them to commit more ships than they'd planned, and the battle became a swirling chaos of explosions and debris that made tactical displays nearly useless. Inside, Station Vertex civilians evacuated through emergency portals, while security forces set up defensive positions at key junctions, and somewhere in the chaos Krell infiltration teams breached the hull and began hunting for Wraith. Lieutenant Yuna was supposed to be on an evacuation ship, but she'd stayed behind to coordinate civilian resistance. And when Krell commandos reached Junction 7, near the residential sections, she was there with a rifle she barely knew how to use. The infiltrators were elite troops in powered armor with weapons designed to punch through military shields, and they moved through the corridors with the confidence of soldiers who'd never been stopped before. They met Yuna and a group of civilians who refused to run, and the firefight that followed would be remembered as one of the most desperate last stands in station history. Yuna took 3 hits that her light armor mostly absorbed and kept firing until her rifle overheated. And when a Krell commando grabbed her, she pulled a plasma grenade from her belt and triggered it at point-blank range. The explosion killed the commando and wounded 2 others, but Yuna survived because she'd timed the detonation perfectly, and reinforcements arrived seconds later to find her unconscious but alive among the wreckage. Priest Warrior Malik and his order held Junction 7 with traditional bladed weapons that seemed absurd against modern firearms, and the Anthar Warrior moved with practiced precision that came from a lifetime of combat training. As people believed, Hyunwoo was prophesied in their ancient texts as the Beast Speaker who would unite the galaxy against darkness. And whether the prophecy was real or interpreted to fit current events didn't matter, because Malik believed completely, and his warriors bought time for thousands of civilians to evacuate, and they paid for every second with blood. And when the battle was over, only 3 of the 12 warriors remained standing. Hyunwoo and Wraith launched from Station Vertex while the siege raged around them, and the stealth shuttle slipped through the battle using debris fields as cover. And Bora's modifications worked better than she'd promised. They approached the Krell flagship from below where its sensors had blind spots, and Wraith used his crystal armor to cut through the hull while Hyunwoo sealed the breach behind them. The ship's interior was a maze of corridors designed for species larger than humans, but Wraith moved through them like he'd been born there, And through their bond, Hyunwoo understood that war beasts had boarded countless ships across the centuries. They fought through deck after deck with Wraith handling combat, while Hyunwoo managed their route. And the bond between them had grown so deep that they moved as one organism with two bodies. Krell security forces tried to stop them with everything from plasma rifles to electromagnetic nets, and each attempt failed because Hyunwoo and Wraith had learned to anticipate and counter together. They reached the command deck and found Warlord Therix waiting with his personal guard. And the Krell commander was easily 3 times Hyunwoo's mass with cybernetic enhancements that turned him into a weapon. Therix dismissed his guards with a gesture and spoke to Hyunwoo in surprisingly fluent human standard. "Language, you've impressed me enough that I'll make the offer one final time. Join the Dominion and rule as equals or die. Hear and achieve nothing." Hyunwoo felt Wraith's uncertainty through the bond and understood why, because the war beast had seen the Council's flaws and knew how many species would happily sacrifice humanity to save themselves. For a moment he considered it because the Krell offered something simple, which was strength respected and rewarded, and the Council offered only complicated politics and conditional acceptance. Then he thought about Yuna taking a blade for him, and Jiwon fighting impossible political battles, and Daejung trusting him with command, and Malik believing in prophecies that gave people hope. He thought about his brother who died because no one acted fast enough, and all the people on Station Vertex who were fighting right now because they believed cooperation was worth defending, and told Therix no, the fight that followed was brutal and personal, because Therix was a warrior who'd killed hundreds in single combat, and his weapons had ended lives across a dozen species. But Hyunwoo and Wraith were something new, which was a perfect partnership between two beings who trusted each other completely, and that made them stronger than the sum of their parts. They moved around Therix's attacks and struck back with coordinated precision, and slowly the Krell commander began to realize he was fighting something he couldn't beat alone. The battle ended when Wraith pinned Therix against the command console, and Hyunwoo held a plasma cutter to the flagship's reactor controls, gave Therix a choice, which was order the retreat or watch his entire fleet die when the reactor detonated. The Krell commander stared at him for a long moment and then began laughing, and he issued the retreat order while complimenting Hyunwoo's tactics. The Krell armada withdrew from the Vertex system and left behind their ground forces to whatever fate awaited them, and Admiral Taeyang couldn't quite believe they'd survived. Hyunwoo collapsed on the shuttle ride back to Station Vertex and woke up 3 days later in medical with Wraith standing guard. And the war beast sent relief and pride through their bond. They'd proven themselves, but the cost had been high, and the galaxy would never look at humanity the same way again. Sometimes surviving was the same as winning. The aftermath of the siege of Vertex rippled across the galaxy like waves from a stone dropped in still water, and species that had dismissed humanity as upstart newcomers suddenly needed to reconsider everything they thought they knew. The Krell Dominion entered peace negotiations from a position they'd never experienced before, which was weakness, and Warlord Therix was removed from command by his own officers, who installed a reformist faction that actually seemed interested in diplomacy. Council Chair Mevix had led the Galactic Council for 2 centuries and survived countless political storms. But watching a human captain and his war beast accomplish what entire fleets couldn't made him realize the old ways were dying. He called a Reformation Summit and invited every species to send representatives, and for the first time in living memory, the Council began discussing fundamental changes to how galactic governance worked. Hyunwoo wanted nothing to do with politics because all he'd ever wanted was to do his job and protect people. But his bond with Wraith and his actions during the siege had made him a symbol, whether he liked it or not. Some species saw him as humanity's finest representative, while others viewed him as a dangerous wildcard who disrupted centuries of careful balance. And the invitations and demands flooded in faster than Lieutenant Yuna could process them. She'd recovered from her injuries with a scar across her ribs that she wore like a badge of honor, and she managed Hyunwoo's schedule with the same efficiency she'd shown during the battle. Humanity earned a permanent seat at the Council high table, not because they demanded it, but because they demonstrated something the older species had forgotten, which was willingness to sacrifice for others without calculating the benefit. First Ambassador Jiwon accepted the position with a speech that reminded everyone how humanity had been dismissed and patronized for 3 decades, and she promised that her species would never forget who stood with them and who voted to surrender them. Dr. Bora made a discovery that changed everything while conducting routine medical scans on Wraith. The Warbeast was pregnant. The revelation seemed impossible because Wraith was supposedly the last Vornak and had been alone for millennia. But Bora's tests confirmed that the Warbeast had preserved genetic material from a mate who died centuries ago. Wraith had been carrying this potential new life for longer than most species recorded histories and waited for a bond strong enough to risk bringing offspring into the galaxy. Through their connection, Hyunwoo felt Wraith's fear and hope mixed together, and he understood that the Warbeast needed to know the future would be different before allowing new life to enter at the A. Pregnancy lasted 4 months and drew attention from researchers across the galaxy who wanted to study the process. But Hyunwoo refused all requests because Wraith deserved privacy during such a vulnerable time. When the birth finally happened, it was in a quiet facility on Earth where Hyunwoo had grown up, and only Bora and a small medical team were present to help. The pup emerged with crystalline armor already forming, and eyes that held curiosity rather than the ancient weariness that marked Wraith. And it was no larger than a human dog, but moved with coordination that shouldn't have been possible for a newborn. Hyunwoo held the tiny warbeast and felt overwhelming protectiveness through his bond with Wraith. And he knew that this small life represented hope for an entire species that had been extinct. The question became what to do next, because the Vornak warbeasts were bred to be weapons but didn't have to remain weapons forever. Hyunwoo's niece, Gina, visited from Seoul with her school class on a field trip to see the famous warbeast, and the teenager approached Wraith's pup with none of the fear that adults showed. She asked if she could pet the creature, and Hyunwoo nodded, and the pup bounded toward Gina with puppy enthusiasm that seemed completely at odds with its species reputation. The young warbeast nuzzled her hand, and a weak bond formed between them that was nothing like the warrior link Hyunwoo shared with Wraith, and it was gentler and more about companionship than combat. Gina laughed and scratched behind the pup's crystalline ears, and through his bond with Wraith, Hyunwoo felt the adult warbeast satisfaction. This was what Wraith had been hoping for, which was a future where warbeasts could choose different paths. Bora analyzed the pup's genetics and confirmed that Wraith had preserved enough genetic material to grow several more offspring, and each one could potentially bond with a human who approached them with respect rather than calculation. Ambassador Jiwon proposed the creation of the Beast Speaker Academy where humans and war beasts could learn together, and the council approved the proposal with surprising speed. The academy would be a place where bonds formed naturally, based on mutual respect, and where young war beasts could grow up knowing they had choices about their futures. Hyunwoo received offers of promotion and command positions and political appointments that would have made him one of the most powerful humans in the galaxy, but he declined every single one. Instead, he accepted the role of first instructor at the Beast Speaker Academy, because teaching the next generation felt more important than commanding fleets. The construction site was located in the mountains outside Seoul, where Hyunwoo's family had lived for generations, and the design incorporated both human and Primarch architectural elements. To honor both species involved, Wraith's other pups grew from the preserved genetic material in specialized incubation chambers, and each one emerged with slightly different coloring and temperament. Some were bold and adventurous, while others were cautious and thoughtful. And watching them play together reminded Hyunwoo that they were people, not weapons. Young humans volunteered to attend the academy from across Earth and the colonies, and they came with dreams of bonding with legendary creatures. But the academy's first lesson was simple, which was that warbeasts were not prizes to be won or tools to be wielded, but partners who deserved respect. Not every human who applied would bond with a warbeast, and that was acceptable because forcing connections never worked. Gina enrolled as one of the first students with her pup companion, who she'd named Hanul, and the weak bond between them grew stronger as they learned together. On a clear morning 6 months after the academy opened, Hyunwoo and Wraith stood on a cliff overlooking the construction that was still ongoing, and below them in a field young warbeasts played while their human partners watched. Some bonds had formed while others were still developing, and the students learned that patience mattered more than ambition. Through their connection, Wraith communicated something he'd never felt before, which was hope for a future that didn't involve endless war. The Krell remained a potential threat, and political tensions continued across the galaxy, and new challenges would certainly arise. because the universe never stopped being complicated, but for the first time in thousands of years, the galaxy faced its future with something it hadn't felt in living memory, which was optimism that things could actually improve. Hyunwoo thought about his brother who died because people didn't act fast enough, and he hoped that the Academy would produce leaders who understood that protecting others mattered more than protecting interests. Wraith made that rumbling sound that meant contentment and sent feelings through the bond that didn't need words. They had found each other in a corridor, filled with frost and fear, and from that moment of connection had come changes that rippled across an entire galaxy. The war beasts were no longer weapons, but people with choices, and humanity had proven that newcomers could teach old civilizations forgotten lessons about trust. Below them in the field, a young war beast and a teenage girl laughed together while learning to move in sync, and their bond was gentler than combat-forged connections, but no less real. The future remained unwritten and full of challenges, but it belonged to those brave enough to believe that impossible things could become possible through courage and connection. Hyunwoo looked at his companion who had chosen him when he was just a captain trying to do his job, and Wraith looked back with ancient eyes that had finally found peace. They were partners and friends, and proof that even in a galaxy built on cynicism and power, there was room for trust, and sometimes that was the greatest weapon of all. The alarm screamed through the medical frigate at 3 a.m, and Jiwon was already pulling on her boots before her brain fully registered what was happening. 7 years in the Frontier Medical Corps had trained her body to respond, before her mind caught up and she was running down the corridor toward the bridge while other crew members were still stumbling out of their quarters. The ship's emergency lights painted everything red, and she could hear Captain Minho's voice barking orders through the communication system, but the words were too fast and overlapping for her to understand yet. She burst onto the bridge and immediately saw the problem displayed on the main screen. A ship was dying out there in the darkness of space, and it was sending out a distress call that made Jiwon's stomach twist into knots. The transmission was breaking apart and full of static, but she could hear the voice of someone young and terrified, and the words that came through were enough to paint a horrible picture. 200 cubs were sick and the adults were all dead, and the ship was drifting, and they needed help now, because the children were dying and there was so much blood. Minho turned to look at her, and his face was grim in the red emergency lighting, and he said they had intercepted a Veltharan transport ship about 4 hours away at maximum speed. The Veltharan were a species that looked like enormous cats that walked on 2 legs, and they were proud and aggressive, and had nearly gone to war with humanity twice in the past decade. Their colony ship had suffered some kind of outbreak, and, according to the broken transmissions, every single adult on board was already dead from a hemorrhagic fever that was tearing through their systems. Jiwon moved closer to the screen and asked how many children were on board, and Minho's jaw tightened as he told her, 200 cubs ranging from age 3 to 11 in human years. They were alone on a floating tomb and dying from the same disease that had killed their parents and guardians, and they had maybe 2 days before organ failure took them all. The medical officer standing next to Minho pulled up the preliminary data they had managed to extract from the Veltharan ship's automated systems, and Jiwon felt her heart sink as she read through the symptoms. Massive internal bleeding and fever, spiking above 107 degrees, and cardiovascular collapse, and the cubs were already starting to go into shock. This was bad, and it was going to get worse, and the Veltharan Collective had very strict quarantine protocols that meant ships like this were supposed to be destroyed on sight to prevent pandemic spread. Minho confirmed what she was thinking when he told her that Galactic Command had already issued the order, and a Veltharan warship was en route to blow the transport out of space before the infection could spread to any populated systems. Jiwon asked how long they had before the warship arrived, and Minho said maybe 16 hours, and the transport would be in their range in 4 hours, which meant they had a very narrow window. She could see where this was going, and she asked if they were going to attempt a rescue, and Minho's expression became even more serious as he told her that Command had expressly forbidden any approach to the infected vessel. The risk was too high, and the Veltharan themselves had demanded that no one interfere with their quarantine procedures, even if it meant their own children died. She stared at the screen showing the drifting ship tumbling slowly through space, and somewhere inside that metal shell 200 children were suffering alone in the dark, surrounded by the corpses of everyone they knew. Jiwon had specialized in xenopediatric medicine specifically because she believed that children were children, regardless of what species they belonged to, and the idea of leaving them to die or be blown apart by missiles made something fierce and stubborn rise up in her chest. Minho seemed to read her mind because he said her name in a warning tone and told her that she was not to even think about what he knew she was thinking about. Going over there would be suicide, and she had no cure for the disease. And even if she survived the infection, she would be trapped when the warship arrived. Jiwon turned to face him fully and asked if he really expected her to just watch, while 200 kids died and Minho's face softened slightly, but his voice remained firm as he said yes because that was the order, and more importantly, that was the smart thing to do. The bridge fell silent except for the quiet beeping of various instruments, and Jiwon realized that everyone was watching her and waiting to see what she would do. She had always been the medic who stayed with patients long after others had given up, and she had been reprimanded twice for refusing to evacuate medical stations until every wounded person was off first. And Minho knew her well enough to know that orders and logic were not going to change her mind about this. She told him she was going, and Minho immediately said no. But Jiwon was already turning toward the door and explaining that she needed to prep a medical shuttle and gather supplies. Minho moved to block her path, and his voice rose as he ordered her to stand down, but she met his eyes steadily and said she was sorry, but she could not follow that order. The captain could put her in the brig after this was over or discharge her from the service. But right now she was getting on a shuttle and flying to that ship, because someone had to try. The other bridge officers were frozen and uncertain, and Jiwon could see Minho struggling with his own conscience, and finally he stepped aside, but told her that once she docked with that infected ship, the airlock would seal behind her. He could not risk bringing her back and contaminating the sanctuary's hope, and she would be alone over there with no support and no extraction. Jiwon nodded and said she understood, and Minho asked if she was really willing to die for alien children who belonged to a species that hated humans. She paused at the door and looked back at him and said they were still children, and that was all the reason she needed. Before Minho could respond again, she was gone and running toward the shuttle bay, while mentally cataloging what medical supplies she would need and knowing it would not be enough. 200 patients and limited resources and a disease she did not fully understand yet meant she was going to have to perform miracles with whatever she could carry. The shuttle bay was cold and echoing, and Jiwon worked quickly to load equipment into the small medical shuttle while trying not to think too hard about what she was doing. If she stopped to consider the reality of the situation, she might lose her nerve, and she could not afford that. She sealed the cargo area and climbed into the pilot seat and began the launch sequence, and that was when she remembered her brother Daehyun back on Earth. He was younger than her by 5 years, and he worried about her constantly and sent her messages every week, begging her to transfer to a safer posting. Jiwon pulled up the communication panel and started recording a message, and her voice was steady, as she told him that if he was hearing this, then she had not made it back. She told him she loved him, and that she was proud of the man he had become, and that someone always had to try even when the odds were impossible, because that was what it meant to be human. She ended the recording and cued it to send automatically, if she failed to check in within 72 hours, and then she finished the launch sequence. The shuttle lifted off the deck and rotated toward the bay doors, and Jiwon could see the sanctuary's hope falling away behind her as she accelerated toward the dying Veltheran ship. The distance closed steadily, and she spent the time reviewing what little medical data they had managed to gather and trying to formulate a treatment plan with insufficient information. The Veltheran transport finally appeared on her sensors, and it looked dead already with running lights flickering, and the hull showing signs of damage from improper attitude control. Jiwon guided her shuttle toward the main airlock and hoped the docking mechanisms were still functional, because if they were not, this was going to be a very short rescue attempt. The clamps engaged with a solid thunk that she felt through the hull, and she sat there for a moment staring at the sealed door that led to the infected ship. This was her last chance to turn back and return to safety and follow orders like a sensible person would do. Instead, Jiwon grabbed her medical kit and opened the airlock and stepped into the darkness where 200 children were waiting to see if anyone in the universe still cared whether they lived or died. The heat hit Jiwon like a physical wall the moment she crossed through the airlock and into the Veltheran ship, and she immediately understood why the cubs were suffering so badly. The environmental controls were failing, and the temperature inside the vessel had climbed to levels that would kill most species, and the air was thick and humid, and hard to breathe. She activated her suit's cooling system and adjusted her helmet's display to filter the ultraviolet lighting that the Veltherin preferred, and suddenly the corridor ahead of her became visible in shades of purple, and blue bodies lay scattered along the hallway. And Ji-won forced herself to look at them clinically rather than emotionally, because falling apart now would not help anyone. The adult Veltherin had died badly, and their fur was matted with dried blood and their faces were frozen in expressions of pain and terror. She stepped carefully around them and made her way deeper into the ship while her medical scanner picked up faint life signs coming from somewhere toward the center of the vessel. The ship creaked and groaned around her, and somewhere in the distance she could hear a strange keening sound that might have been wind through damaged hull plates or might have been something crying. Ji-won followed the life signs and tried not to think about the fact that her shuttle's airlock had sealed behind her exactly as Minho had promised, and there was no way back now. She was committed, and she would either save these children or die trying, and there was something almost freeing about having no other options. The corridor opened into a larger chamber that looked like it had once been a common area and now resembled a nightmare. More bodies here and signs of panic, with furniture overturned and claw marks gouged into the walls where someone had tried desperately to hold on. The life signs were stronger now and coming from a sealed door at the far end of the room, and Ji-won approached it carefully while announcing herself in broken Veltherin that her translator had taught her. She called out that she was a healer and she was here to help, and she meant no harm, and the response was immediate and hostile. Something heavy slammed against the door from the inside, and voices started yelling in the snarling, rapid-fire language of the Veltherin, and her translator struggled to keep up. The words it managed to catch were mostly curses and accusations and demands that she go away and leave them alone, and threats about what would happen if she tried to enter. Ji-won stood her ground and kept her voice calm and steady as she explained that she was human and she was a doctor and she knew they were sick and she wanted to help them. The yelling continued, but she thought she detected a slight change in tone, and after a moment a younger voice cut through the chaos and demanded to know why a human would come here. She recognized that this was the critical moment, and what she said next would determine whether these children let her help them or fought her until they all died. She told them the truth simply and directly. She said their adults were dead and their ship was dying and a warship was coming to destroy them, and she was their only chance at survival. There was a long silence on the other side of the door, and then the same young voice asked why she would risk her life for Veltherin cubs when everyone knew humans and Veltherin hated each other. Ji-won felt her throat tighten, and she said because they were children, and that meant something to her even if it did not mean anything to the rest of the galaxy. The door suddenly unsealed with a hiss of equalizing pressure and slid open, and Ji-won found herself staring at a room full of sick and terrified alien children. They were covered in fur that ranged from golden brown to deep black, and their ears were flat against their skulls in fear and aggression, and many of them were visibly bleeding from their noses and mouths. The oldest cub stood at the front holding a metal rod like a weapon, and his amber eyes were bright with fever but also with fierce determination to protect the younger ones behind him. Ji-won very slowly and deliberately reached up and unsealed her helmet and pulled it off, and several of the cubs hissed in surprise at this breach of quarantine protocol. She met the eldest cub's eyes and said in careful Veltherin that her name was Ji-won, and she was a healer and she would not leave them no matter what happened. The cub with the metal rod stared at her for a long moment and then asked her name again as if testing whether she would answer, and she repeated it patiently, lowered the rod slightly, and said his name was Hyunwoo and he was 10 years old and he had been trying to take care of the others, but he did not know what to do because they kept getting sicker. Ji-won took a careful step forward and said she needed to examine them and start treatment immediately, and Hyunwoo nodded slowly, but several of the other cubs made sounds of protest. One of them in particular moved forward with her lips pulled back to show sharp teeth and her claws extended, and she said humans could not be trusted and this was probably a trick. The aggressive cub looked to be about 8 years old, and her fur was a deep russet color and her eyes were filled with equal parts fear and rage. Ji-won asked her name gently, and the cub spat that she was Yoonji, and she knew humans had probably caused this plague to kill Veltherin. Ji-won did not argue or get defensive and instead just said that she understood why Yoonji would think that, but it was not true, and right now they did not have time for this because cubs were dying, as if to Emphasize her point, a small voice called out weakly from the back of the room, and Jiwon saw a tiny cub who could not have been more than 6 years old lying on a makeshift bed of cushions. The little one's fur was soaked with sweat and blood, and her breathing was rapid and shallow, and Jiwon's medical training immediately recognized the signs of approaching cardiovascular collapse. She did not wait for permission but moved quickly toward the sick cub while pulling out her medical scanner, and Hyunwoo translated quickly to the others that the human was trying to help. The small cub's name was Sora, and she was barely conscious, and her body temperature was dangerously high even by Veltharan standards. Jiwon ran the scanner over her and pulled up the readings on her data pad and felt her heart sink at what she saw. Multiple organ systems were shutting down, and the child had maybe an hour before complete failure. And Jiwon's equipment was designed for human physiology, not Veltharan. She would have to adapt everything on the fly and hope it worked. She called Hyunwoo over and asked him rapid questions about Veltharan biology while she worked, and he answered as best he could. But he was just a child himself and did not know technical details. Jiwon made her best guesses based on what she knew of similar species and began setting up an IV line, but her human needles were too small for Veltharan veins. She grabbed a larger bore needle from her surgical kit, and Sora whimpered as Jiwon inserted it but did not have the strength to pull away. The other cubs watched in tense silence as Jiwon hung a bag of fluid and adjusted the drip rate and then pulled out medication that she hoped would reduce the fever and support Sora's failing hearts. Veltharan had 2 hearts, and right now both of them were struggling and arrhythmic, and Jiwon did not have the right drugs for this. She had human cardiac medications, and she would have to calculate dosages based on body mass and hope she did not accidentally poison the child while trying to save her. Sora's breathing became even more labored, and suddenly her body convulsed, and Hyunwoo made a sound of distress and said she was dying. Jiwon felt time slow down the way it always did in critical moments, and her hands moved with practiced efficiency as she prepared a modified dose of epinephrine and injected it directly into Sora's chest. The cub gasped and arched and then went terrifyingly still, and for 3 endless seconds Jiwon thought she had failed. Then Sora's eyes fluttered open and she took a shuddering breath, and her hearts began to beat in a more regular rhythm. Jiwon sagged with relief and checked the monitors and saw that while Sora was not out of danger, the immediate crisis had passed. She looked up and realized that every single cub in the room was staring at her with wide eyes, and Hyunwoo said softly that he had thought Sora was already dead. Jiwon managed a tired smile and said not yet, and not if she had anything to say about it. She turned to look at the rest of the cubs and began doing a quick visual assessment, and her stomach dropped as she counted them. Hyunwoo had said 200, but she could only see about 30 in this room, and she asked where the others were. Hyunwoo's ears drooped, and he explained that the cubs had scattered throughout the ship when the adults started dying, and he had only managed to gather the youngest ones here in the nursery. That meant there were 170 more sick children somewhere in this failing ship, and Jiwon was one person with limited supplies and no backup. She stood up and squared her shoulders and said they needed to find the others and bring them here and start treatment on everyone immediately. Yoonji made a scoffing sound and asked how one human thought she could save all of them. And Jiwon met her challenging gaze and said she would find a way or die trying. A small voice spoke up from near Sora's bed, and a tiny cub, who had been grooming the sick child's fur, looked at Jiwon with huge eyes and asked if she was really going to stay with them. Jiwon knelt down to be at eye level with the little one and asked her name, and the cub whispered that she was Sunhee and she was 5 years old. Jiwon told Sunhee that yes. 18 hours had passed since Jiwon first entered the dying ship, and she had not slept and had barely eaten, and her body was starting to rebel against what she was demanding of it. She had found and treated 143 cubs so far, and every single one of them was still alive, which felt like a miracle, but also meant she was running on borrowed time. Her medical supplies were almost gone, and she had resorted to cutting dosages in half and stretching IV fluids with sterilized water from the ship's recycling system, and hoping that her makeshift solutions would be enough. The cubs had started calling her something in their language that Hyunwoo translated as Strange Mother, and the title made her throat tight with emotion every time she heard it. They brought her sick cubs from the far corners of the ship, and she worked on each one with the same focused intensity, while Hyunwoo stood at her side translating and learning and becoming something like her assistant. He had figured out how to read the vital signs monitors and could now spot when a cub was going into crisis before Jiwon's equipment alerted her, and his steady presence was the only thing keeping her grounded. Sora had recovered enough to sit up and take small amounts of food, and she watched Jiwon work with huge, wondering eyes, and occasionally reached out to touch Jiwon's hand, as if confirming she was real. Sunhee had attached herself to Jiwon like a shadow and helped by bringing water and supplies and grooming Jiwon's hair in the Veltheran way of showing affection to family members. Even Unji had stopped openly challenging everything Jiwon did, though she still watched with suspicious eyes and kept her distance. The breakthrough came when Jiwon was examining a cub who had somehow remained healthier than the others, despite being exposed to the same conditions. She ran her scanner over him multiple times and checked his blood work and suddenly understood what she was dealing with. This was not a virus or bacteria, but a parasitic infection that normally the Veltheran immune system could fight off easily. But these cubs had been malnourished and stressed from the failed colony mission, and their defenses were too weak. She pulled up everything she knew about parasitic diseases and cross-referenced it with Veltheran biology and human treatments, and a theory began to form. If she could boost their immune systems enough, the cubs' own bodies might be able to fight off the parasites, but she had no Veltheran immune boosters and her human medications were not designed for their physiology. She sat back on her heels and rubbed her burning eyes and tried to think of another option, and that was when her communicator crackled to life. Minho's voice came through rough and urgent, and he said they had a problem. The Veltheran warship had arrived early, and they were demanding that the transport ship be destroyed immediately, and they would not listen to any arguments about the children on board. Jiwon felt ice flood her veins, and she asked how much time she had, and Minho said maybe 4 hours before the warship opened fire. He told her that he had positioned the Sanctuary's Hope between the two vessels, but that was an act of war, and he could not hold the position forever. She thanked him and told him she needed just a little more time to figure out the treatment, and Minho's voice softened as he said there was no more time, and she needed to accept that she had done everything possible. Jiwon looked around at the cubs who were watching her with varying degrees of understanding, and she said into the communicator that she was not giving up, and Minho could not order her to abandon them. There was a long pause, and then Minho said he knew, and that was why he had not even tried. But she should know that command was ordering him to withdraw, and if he did not comply soon, he would be relieved of command. The transmission ended, and Jiwon sat in the hot, stinking air of the Veltheran ship surrounded by dying children and tried to figure out how to save them all with no supplies and no time and no support. Hyunwoo asked what the human captain had said, and Jiwon did not lie to him because he deserved the truth. She said the warship was here, and they were going to destroy the transport and everyone on board, and Hyunwoo's ears flattened against his skull, but his voice was steady as he asked how long they had. She told him 4 hours, maybe less, and several of the cubs who understood made sounds of fear and despair. Yoonji stood up abruptly and demanded to know why Jiwon had even come here if she was just going to let them all die anyway, and Jiwon felt her exhaustion and frustration boil over into anger. She snapped back that she had come here because no one else would, and she had given up everything to try to save them, and she was not done fighting yet, so Yoonji could either help or get out of the way. The two of them stared at each other, and something shifted in Yoonji's expression, and she asked what Jiwon needed. It was the first time the suspicious cub had offered to help without hostility, and Jiwon took a breath and forced herself to think clearly. She explained her theory about the parasites and the immune system and said what she needed was something to boost their natural defenses, but she did not have the right medicine. Hyunwoo asked if there was anything at all that might work, and Jiwon hesitated before saying there was one option, but it was dangerous. Human blood plasma contained antibodies and immune factors that might give the cub systems the boost they needed to fight off the infection. It was not a cure, but it might buy enough time for their bodies to win the battle on their own. The problem was that she was one human, and there were 200 cubs, and she could not possibly donate enough blood to treat all of them. Hyunwoo processed this and then asked how much blood she would need to give to treat everyone, and Jiwon did the math in her head and felt sick at the answer. She would need to drain herself almost completely dry, and even then it might not be enough, and she would certainly die from blood loss. Hyunwoo's eyes widened, and he said she could not do that, and Ji-won smiled tiredly and said she did not see any other choice. Before Hyun-woo could argue, she was already setting up the equipment to draw her blood and process it into usable plasma, and she tried not to think about what she was doing, or she might lose her nerve. The first donation left her dizzy and weak, but she pushed through and treated 20 cubs with the precious plasma and watched with fierce satisfaction as their vital signs began to stabilize. She rested for 15 minutes and then drew more blood and treated another 20, and by the time she finished the third donation, she was having trouble standing. Hyun-woo begged her to stop, and Sun-hee was crying, and even Yoon-ji looked concerned, but Ji-won shook her head and kept working. Sora had moved closer and was watching with understanding beyond her years, and she asked in a small voice if Ji-won was dying to save them. Ji-won did not answer directly, but instead stroked the cub's fur and said that everyone was going to be fine. And Sora's eyes filled with tears as she said the human was lying. The fourth blood donation made Ji-won's vision gray out at the edges, and her hands shook so badly that Hyun-woo had to help her hold the needle steady, and she could feel her heart racing as it tried to compensate for the blood loss. She treated. Another group of cubs and the plasma was working better than she had dared hope, and their fevers were dropping and the bleeding was slowing, and their immune systems were finally mounting an effective response. Ji-won allowed herself a moment of hope before starting the fifth donation, and this time her legs gave out halfway through, and she collapsed against the wall. Hyun-woo caught her, and his voice was frantic as he said that was enough, and she had to stop and she was going to die. Ji-won tried to focus on his face, but her vision was blurry, and she said there were still cubs who needed treatment and she could give a little more. Yoon-ji suddenly knelt in front of her and grabbed her shoulders and demanded to know why a human would die for Veltharan cubs when their two species had been enemies for years. Ji-won looked at her and said because they were children, and that was all the reason she needed, and Yoon-ji's face crumpled and she started crying and said she was sorry for being so horrible. The communicator crackled again and Minho's voice was urgent as he said the Veltharan warship was charging weapons, and he had maybe 10 minutes before they opened fire. He begged Ji-won to get to her shuttle and evacuate, and even if she could not save all the cubs, she could at least save herself. Ji-won's fumbling fingers could not find the communicator, and Hyun-woo held it to her ear, and she said with the last of her strength that she was staying and Minho should get the sanctuary's hope clear. Minho made a sound that might have been a sob or a laugh, and he said he was not going anywhere either, and if the Veltharan wanted to destroy the transport, they would have to go through a human medical frigate first. Ji-won wanted to tell him not to throw his life and his crew away, but her tongue felt thick and clumsy and the world was fading to gray. She thought she heard more voices on the communicator and Minho saying something about media drones and war crimes, but the words were getting farther away. Hyun-woo was calling her name, and Sun-hee was pressed against her side crying, and Yoon-ji was saying please don't die over and over, and Ji-won wanted to reassure them, but she could not make her mouth work anymore. The last thing she was conscious of was Sora's small paw touching her face gently, and a voice she did not recognize coming through the ship's communication system, saying something in rapid Veltharan that made Hyun-woo gasp, "Do."